Imagine running an empire. Millions of citizens, armies at your command, palaces dripping in gold, and somehow losing it all because you forgot to pack lunch. That's not a joke. Entire civilizations have collapsed over blunders so dumb they make forgetting your Netflix password look like military strategy. We like to picture history as grand battles and noble leaders, but half the time it's just kings tripping over their own egos, generals misreading a map, or emperors literally starving their people because bread felt optional. And here's the kicker. Those were the smart ones. The real disasters, the ones that toppled centuries of power, make modern politics look like kindergarten recess. And trust me, what's coming next is even dumber. 1. Imagine being one of the richest empires in the world, with control over trade routes, gold pouring in, and a palace big enough to make Versailles look like a studio apartment. Now imagine deciding, hey, maybe we don't need to pay the army this month. That's exactly what the Ottoman sultans did, multiple times. And surprise, the soldiers didn't exactly say, it's fine, we'll volunteer. No, they rioted, looted the capital, and occasionally overthrew the sultan like he was a bad manager at a Walmart. This is basically the medieval version of forgetting to Venmo your roommate for Wi-Fi, except instead of passive-aggressive texts, you get stabbed in the street. The Ottomans called these mutinies the Janissary revolts, but really, they were just payroll disputes with extra decapitations. It's amazing how fast an empire goes from unstoppable world power to unpaid intern disaster zone. Honestly, the empire didn't collapse because of outsiders. It collapsed because HR forgot to cut checks. 2. Here's a fun fact. Russia has winters. Shocking, I know. But apparently Napoleon Bonaparte didn't get that memo. In 1812, he marched his invincible Grand Army, over 600,000 men, into Russia, expecting a quick victory. Instead, he ran into a combination of scorched earth tactics, supply shortages, and, oh yeah, frozen death. His army starved, froze, and limped back home with less than 10% of its original size. It wasn't a war. It was basically the world's worst camping trip. Imagine dragging 500,000 men into Siberian weather with zero thermal socks and thinking it'll be fine. It's like showing up to Antarctica in flip-flops and then being surprised you can't colonize penguins. The Russians didn't even need to win battles. They just let winter do the heavy lifting. And Napoleon? He proved that even one of history's greatest generals can be defeated by a season. All that ambition, all that genius, destroyed by something a middle school geography teacher could have warned him about. 3. The Ming Dynasty had the most advanced naval fleet in the 1400s. Giant treasure ships, fleets that made Columbus's boats look like bath toys, sailors mapping trade routes across oceans. They were basically the Elon Musk of seafaring, except instead of launching rockets, they launched cities on water. And then, in a masterstroke of short-sighted genius, the emperor decided, nah, too expensive. Scrap the whole navy. So they burned the blueprints, let the ships rot, and abandoned global trade. The result? While Europe was busy discovering continents that already had people on them, China was sitting at home like a kid who gave up piano lessons right before becoming a prodigy. This wasn't just a missed opportunity, it was the historical equivalent of deleting your winning lottery numbers because the ticket took up too much space in your wallet. And centuries later, when Europeans showed up with cannons, the Chinese suddenly realized maybe those ships weren't such a bad idea. Congratulations, Ming Dynasty, you invented self-sabotage. 4. Rome in Decline was like a sitcom that went on 5 seasons too long. Out of fresh ideas, out of energy, just running on brand recognition. And in their desperation, the Romans came up with the worst plan imaginable: hire the people invading them, to stop people invading them. Yes, the empire literally paid barbarian tribes to serve as soldiers against other barbarian tribes. This was not 4D chess. This was handing your house keys to the burglar because he promised to keep other burglars away. Spoiler, it did not work. The mercenaries took the money, the land, and eventually just walked into Rome like, yeah, this is ours now. Imagine paying someone to babysit your kid, and instead they sell your house and adopt themselves as the new parent. That's Rome, not conquered by outsiders, but by their own payroll department. It's less of a collapse and more of a punchline. 5. If you want a masterclass in bad first impressions, look no further than the Aztecs meeting Hernan Cortez. Here comes a ragtag band of Spaniards, half of them seasick, dressed in metal pajamas, riding animals the locals had never seen before. And the Aztecs? They decided this must be Quetzalcoatl, their feathered serpent god, back to visit. Instead of killing the strangers on sight, they gave them gifts, gold, and basically rolled out the red carpet. Cortés, being a humble man, responded by betraying them, murdering their leaders, and conquering the empire. This wasn't just a mistake. It was history's worst case of mistaking a Tinder date for your soulmate. You think you're meeting a god, but instead, it's just a greedy conquistador with smallpox. The Aztecs didn't fall to Spanish brilliance. They fell to the same logic that makes people think Nigerian princes are real. 6. The British Empire was vast, powerful, and incredibly stupid when it came to tea. They decided to tax it heavily in the American colonies, essentially charging people premium prices for boiling leaves in water. And when colonists said, no thanks, Britain doubled down like an eBay scalper, insisting the PS5 is worth $2,000. The result? The Boston Tea Party, revolution, and eventually losing the colonies. The empire that conquered India, bullied China, and controlled half the planet lost America because it nickel and dimed hot beverages. This wasn't about sovereignty or philosophy. It was about breakfast drinks. Imagine losing a global empire because you couldn't chill about Lipton. It's like Starbucks collapsing because one guy refused to pay for oat milk. 7. Between World War I and II, France spent a fortune building the Maginot Line, a giant wall of fortifications to keep out Germany. It was big, it was sturdy, it was supposed to be impregnable. There was just one small flaw: it didn't cover Belgium. And by the 1940s, Germany had these new inventions called tanks and planes. So instead of smashing into the wall, the Nazis just went around it, like someone avoiding a puddle on the sidewalk. France basically spent billions on the world's most expensive "Do Not Enter" sign. It would be like installing a titanium front door and then leaving the windows open. The Germans didn't defeat French defenses, they just politely ignored them. And that's how one of Europe's great powers got flattened in weeks. 8. In 1979, the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan, assuming it would be over in a matter of months. We'll just roll in, wave the flag, set up shop, and be back in time for vodka, they thought. Instead, they spent a decade bleeding manpower, money, and morale in a brutal guerrilla war. The mountains, the resistance fighters, the terrain. It was basically the boss level of military disasters. The Soviets ended up humiliated, bankrupt, and halfway to collapse. The empire that defeated Hitler lost to farmers with rifles and a really bad attitude about outsiders. It's the same mistake every empire makes in Afghanistan, thinking it's a vacation spot you can just book on Expedia. Spoiler, it's not Disneyland. It's where empires go to die. 9. During the Fourth Crusade, Christian knights set out to liberate Jerusalem from Muslim control. Noble goal, right? Except they got distracted, broke, and ended up sacking Constantinople instead, the capital of fellow Christians. Yes, they literally attacked their own teammates. It's the medieval version of showing up to rescue your kidnapped friend and accidentally mugging his neighbor. The Crusaders looted, burned, and weakened the Byzantine Empire so badly that it never recovered. All because they got confused, greedy, or both. This wasn't divine destiny. It was Google Maps set to chaotic evil. History remembers it as a tragedy. I call it the world's dumbest oopsie. 10. Spain had access to mountains of silver from the Americas. Rivers of wealth poured in, enough to make Scrooge McDuck look broke. And what did Spain do? Instead of investing in infrastructure or technology, they spent it all on wars, luxury, and debt payments. The result was massive inflation. Silver became so worthless that peasants were basically using it as confetti. Imagine winning the lottery, but instead of paying off your house, you just buy flaming swords and start random fights with neighbors. That's Spain. The empire drowned in silver and somehow came out broke. It wasn't treasure. It was the world's shiniest bankruptcy notice. 11. King Xerxes, in his infinite wisdom, wanted to invade Greece by crossing the Hellespont. So he ordered a bridge made of boats tied together. Shockingly, a storm destroyed it. Furious, he commanded soldiers to literally whip the sea as punishment. Yes, the Persian Empire's response to bad weather was corporal punishment on water. Imagine Jeff Bezos spanking the Pacific Ocean because his yacht got delayed. This wasn't engineering, it was stand-up comedy with casualties. And the invasion? A disaster. Turns out, nature doesn't take orders, even from kings. Who knew? 12. The Byzantine Empire had a fun tradition. If a general got too popular, the emperor would blind him so he couldn't challenge for the throne. Brilliant strategy, unless, of course, you need competent generals to defend the empire. Over centuries, they basically performed self-sabotage by mutilating their most effective leaders. It's like firing your best quarterback because he scored too many touchdowns. Eventually, the empire ran out of strong leadership and collapsed under outside pressure. Not because they lacked talent, but because they couldn't stop stabbing themselves in the eyes. Literally. 13. When the Spanish arrived, the Inca Empire was already a mess thanks to smallpox wiping out their population and leadership. But instead of rallying together, the Incas doubled down on civil war. Two brothers fought over the throne while disease tore through the empire. So by the time Pizarro showed up with a few hundred guys, the Incas were basically gift-wrapped for conquest. This wasn't Spanish genius. It was Inca self-destruction, with a little help from European germs. The empire didn't fall to swords. It fell to coughing. 14. Archduke Franz Ferdinand gets shot in Sarajevo. A tragedy, yes. But Austria-Hungary's reaction? Declare war on Serbia. Russia backs Serbia. Germany backs Austria. France and Britain join in. And suddenly, the entire world is in flames because one guy took a wrong turn and got assassinated. It's the geopolitical equivalent of rear-ending someone in traffic and causing a 20-car pileup. Millions died, empires crumbled, and maps were redrawn, all because one empire couldn't handle losing an archduke without throwing the planet into chaos. Talk about an overreaction. 15. Portugal once ruled the seas, controlling trade routes from Asia to Africa to South America. They were rich, powerful, unstoppable. And what did they spend their wealth on? Spices, sugar, and endless luxury goods. It was like a nation-sized teenager blowing their paycheck at Starbucks and Sephora. Instead of building lasting infrastructure, they drowned in debt and decadence. When stronger empires came knocking, Portugal had nothing left but empty purses and a sugar crash. Turns out, building an empire on cinnamon and dessert wine is a shaky business model. 16. At the height of its power, the Tang dynasty decided, you know who should run our empire? Eunuchs men who had been castrated often became palace officials, controlling access to the emperor. Over time, they grabbed so much power that generals and ministers were sidelined. The empire wasn't run by strategy or policy, but by palace gossip and backstabbing. Imagine if the United States handed Congress over to Instagram influencers. It's that level of decision-making. Eventually, the eunuchs' corruption and infighting dragged the dynasty into collapse. Turns out, removing certain organs doesn't make you politically trustworthy. 17. Carthage was a wealthy, powerful empire that could have rivaled Rome forever. Instead, they kept up the charming tradition of sacrificing children to their gods. Nothing screams stable society like tossing your heirs into a fire pit. Meanwhile, Rome was building roads, armies, and infrastructure. So when the two clashed, Carthage was weakened not just by Roman power, but by its own obsession with feeding babies to statues. It's the kind of policy that makes even your enemies think, yeah, you kind of deserve this. Carthage didn't just lose wars, they lost the moral high ground, their future population, and eventually their entire civilization. 18. The Maya had an incredible civilization, astronomy, calendars, pyramids, and then, one day, they decided to chop down too many trees. Seriously, they deforested entire regions to make plaster for temples, and surprise, surprise, that wrecked their environment, messed up rainfall, and triggered massive droughts. Their empire collapsed not because of foreign invaders, but because they needed their buildings extra shiny. Imagine losing your civilization because you couldn't resist putting a glossy Instagram filter on your pyramids. It's like if modern society fell apart because everyone demanded granite countertops at once. All that science, all that culture, undone by the ancient version of Home Depot. 19. Tsar Nicholas II of Russia had one job: don't get your empire killed. Instead, he decided to play World War I like it was a board game. He sent millions of under-equipped peasants into battle, many without rifles, because apparently the Russian strategy was borrow a gun from the guy who dies before you. Shockingly, morale was low. Soldiers deserted in droves, food supplies collapsed, and revolution exploded at home. Nicholas responded with the political savvy of a wet sponge, ignoring everyone until mobs literally forced him off the throne. The Romanovs didn't fall to clever enemies. They fell because their emperor thought competence was optional. It's the historical equivalent of setting your own house on fire because you didn't feel like turning off the stove. 20. The Confederate States of America could have lasted longer if they hadn't treated railroads like optional accessories. Instead of standardizing tracks, each state had its own measurements. That meant trains couldn't run smoothly between regions. Supplies, troops, food, they all had to stop, unload, reload, and move at the speed of a hungover donkey. Meanwhile, the Union had one consistent rail system and moved armies like Amazon Prime. The South literally lost, partly because they couldn't agree on the size of train tracks. It wasn't divine intervention. It wasn't Northern genius. It was basically losing a war because you couldn't figure out USB ports. 21. Alexander the Great conquered half the world by age 32, and then, at the height of his power, he died because he drank too much at a party. That's it. Centuries of planning, empires rising, armies marching, and the guy who thought he was a god probably just poisoned himself with cheap wine. His generals immediately carved up the empire like leftover pizza, and everything collapsed faster than a frat house after finals. Imagine if Jeff Bezos built Amazon, reached global domination, and then lost it all because he went too hard at karaoke night. That's Alexander, proof that sometimes the only true empire killer is a bad hangover. 22. The Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad had the greatest library in the world, the House of Wisdom. Scholars, knowledge, centuries of science. It was humanity's Google before Google. And then, in 1258, the Mongols invaded. Instead of preserving it, they dumped thousands of priceless manuscripts into the Tigris River. Witnesses said the river ran black with ink for days. All that genius, all that progress, wiped out because some warlord thought books were bad coasters. Civilization didn't regress because people lacked intelligence. It regressed because somebody treated humanity's collective hard drive like a recycling bin. 23. The Dutch East India Company once controlled trade routes, armies, and whole colonies. Then they bankrupted themselves buying tulips. Yes, actual flowers. In the 1630s, tulip bulbs became a luxury obsession, and people spent fortunes, sometimes the price of a house, on plants that literally rot in a year. When the bubble burst, the company crashed, fortunes evaporated, and the empire's grip on trade weakened. Imagine losing global dominance because your stock portfolio was based on gardening supplies. The Dutch didn't collapse from invasion. They collapsed because they basically invested everything in a bouquet. 24. The Habsburg dynasty loved keeping power in the family. Unfortunately, they took that literally. Centuries of inbreeding left rulers so genetically scrambled that one king, Charles II of Spain, could barely speak, chew food, or produce an heir. His death ended the Spanish Habsburg line entirely. This wasn't divine will. This was what happens when your dating pool is a family reunion. Spain's empire collapsed not because of armies, but because its rulers treated marriage like an awkward Thanksgiving seating chart. If Tinder had existed, maybe the empire would have lasted longer. 25. Ancient Athens prided itself on democracy, philosophy, and genius. And then they launched the Sicilian expedition during the Peloponnesian War, a grand invasion where they sent a massive fleet to conquer Sicily, without doing basic recon. Turns out, Sicily was not a soft target. The Athenians got bogged down, surrounded, and annihilated. The empire was gutted. This wasn't strategy. This was history's largest did-not-read-the-terms-and-conditions moment. Athens lost its empire not because of overwhelming enemies, but because they impulse-bought a war like it was an infomercial juicer. 26. The Mughal Empire had wealth that made Europe look like a yard sale. And then, instead of investing in defense or infrastructure, their emperors spent fortunes on monuments like the Taj Mahal. Gorgeous? Yes. Practical? Not really. By the time new powers rose, Persians, Afghans, eventually the British, the Mughals were too broke and too distracted polishing marble domes to defend themselves. The empire collapsed because its rulers basically bought a world-class chandelier while their roof was on fire. The Taj Mahal is breathtaking, sure, but it's also history's fanciest bankruptcy notice. 27. The Crusader states in the Middle East had one clear rule for survival: don't annoy everyone around you. Naturally, they ignored that. Instead of integrating with local politics, they antagonized Muslims, Byzantines, and even fellow Christians. They fought among themselves more than against enemies. So when Saladin finally came to crush them, half their allies were already enemies. It wasn't divine punishment. It was the predictable result of running an empire like a toxic group chat where everyone eventually leaves. 28. The Qing dynasty in China had guns, cannons, and the ability to modernize. Instead, they decided the best defense against European imperialism was banning innovation. They doubled down on Confucian tradition, restricted trade, and dismissed Western technology as gimmicks. By the time Britain showed up with steamships and rifles, China was basically defending itself with outdated fireworks. The empire didn't collapse because foreigners were brilliant. It collapsed because its rulers said, "No thanks, we're fine with 14th century tech." It's like trying to fight a hacker with an abacus. 29. The Holy Roman Empire wasn't so much an empire as it was a very complicated family WhatsApp group. Too many princes, too many kingdoms, too many people arguing over who was technically in charge. For centuries, it functioned like a dysfunctional HOA with castles. When Napoleon came along, the whole thing folded almost instantly. Turns out, if your empire is basically a medieval committee meeting, it's not hard to bulldoze. The dumb mistake wasn't losing to Napoleon, it was existing as a glorified group project in the first place. 30. The Zulu kingdom under Shaka Zulu was fierce, disciplined, terrifying. But after his death, his successors decided to fight the British with spears, against rifles, against cannons. It's like showing up to a gunfight with strong opinions and hoping for the best. Their bravery was undeniable, but bravery doesn't reload faster than bullets. The kingdom collapsed because its leaders thought morale could outrun machine parts. Spoiler, it couldn't. 31. The Ottoman Empire once earned the nickname the sick man of Europe, and they embraced it. Instead of reforming their military, modernizing their industry, or cutting down corruption, they basically said, maybe we'll nap this one out. While the rest of Europe industrialized, they stagnated so badly that by World War I, their army was about as modern as a medieval cosplay convention. Empires aren't destroyed by enemies. Sometimes they just die of sheer laziness. 32. Ancient Egypt had one of the longest-lasting civilizations ever. And yet, the empire's decline came partly because pharaohs kept building colossal temples and pyramids they couldn't afford. Entire economies went bankrupt because someone needed a bigger tomb than the last guy. By the end, priests were hoarding wealth, the government was broke, and people were rioting because bread cost too much. Egypt didn't fall to outsiders, it fell to rulers competing in the ancient version of who has the biggest McMansion. 33. The Soviet Union had nuclear weapons, space programs, and global influence. And then it collapsed because it couldn't manage grocery stores, bread lines, empty shelves, shortages of basic goods. It turns out you can't run an empire when people are fighting over toilet paper. All that ideology, all that power undone by cabbage. The USSR didn't lose the Cold War to America's brilliance. It lost because it was defeated by Pepsi, blue jeans, and the idea that maybe people like food. 34. The Mongol Empire stretched from the Pacific to Europe. Then they made one fatal mistake, trying to govern it. Nomadic warriors who excelled at raiding suddenly had to deal with taxes, laws, and administration. Spoiler, they were terrible at it. The empire fractured into smaller khanates, each one squabbling like toddlers fighting over Lego bricks. It turns out conquering the world is easy compared to filing paperwork. The Mongols didn't collapse from enemies. They collapsed from bureaucracy. 35. The Khmer Empire, famous for Angkor Wat, once ruled Southeast Asia. But instead of maintaining their massive irrigation system, the literal lifeline of their empire, they let it clog up. Rice harvests collapsed, famine spread, and the empire with temples so big they can be seen from space fell apart because nobody wanted to clean the gutters. Imagine an entire civilization destroyed by the ancient version of not hiring a plumber. That's right, Angkor Wat, one of the wonders of the world, undone by bad maintenance scheduling. 36. The German Empire in World War I had a simple job. Don't annoy America. And then they sent the infamous Zimmerman telegram offering Mexico a deal to attack the US in exchange for Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona. Mexico politely declined, but the telegram was intercepted, published, and enraged America into joining the war. It's like writing a trash-talking group text about someone and then accidentally adding them to the chat. Germany didn't just poke the bear. They handed it an invitation card and asked it to bring extra guns. 37. Ancient Sparta loved to brag about being invincible warriors, but their downfall wasn't an epic last stand. It was economics. They enslaved so many people, the helots, that they constantly had to suppress rebellions. Eventually, other Greek states ganged up and broke Sparta because it turns out ruling like a CrossFit cult without an actual economy isn't sustainable. The warriors who lived for battle lost not to armies, but to spreadsheets. It's the ancient world's version of a tough guy gym closing down because they forgot to pay rent. 38. The Austro-Hungarian Empire once controlled a massive stretch of Europe, and then they decided to fight World War I. The problem? They couldn't even coordinate their own languages. Orders were translated into half a dozen dialects, and by the time they reached soldiers, commands barely made sense. Imagine trying to run a war like a bad game of telephone, except instead of "send supplies," the message turns into "send sausages." By the end, the empire collapsed not from enemy brilliance, but because nobody knew what anyone else was saying. 39. The Visigoths actually captured Rome in 410 AD. Huge moment. Except instead of turning it into their capital, they left almost immediately. Why? Because the city was too big, too expensive, and too much of a hassle to run. They sacked the greatest city in the world, then said, no thanks. That's like breaking into a billionaire's mansion, looking around, and deciding you'd rather live in your van. The Visigoths didn't just destroy Rome, they rejected it like a bad apartment rental. 40. The Crusader Kingdom of Jerusalem once had an opportunity to secure peace with their Muslim neighbors by negotiating. Instead, their king, Guy of Lusignan, a man whose name already sounds like a bad sitcom character, launched a catastrophic military campaign that ended at the Battle of Hattin. His army, marching across a desert without enough water, was surrounded and obliterated. Jerusalem fell, and the Crusader Kingdom never recovered. This wasn't divine will. It was just a guy named Guy forgetting water bottles. 41. The Ottoman Navy once tried to invade Malta. Bold move. Except their massive fleet ran low on supplies, and instead of retreating strategically, they lingered offshore until disease tore through the army. By the time they attacked, their troops were half dead. This wasn't a siege. It was history's worst camping trip. The mighty empire lost to a tiny island because someone forgot that human beings occasionally need food and water. Napoleon at least had winter as an excuse. The Ottomans? They just packed poorly. 42. Ancient Rome again. Because they were basically the Kardashians of collapse, always finding new ways to embarrass themselves. Emperor Commodus decided to personally fight as a gladiator, except he rigged matches so he always won. The empire's leader spent his days cosplaying as Russell Crowe while the government spiraled. Eventually, his guards got sick of his antics and strangled him in the bath. Rome didn't just decline, it got canceled by its own emperor's hobby. 43. The French Revolution overthrew a monarchy, declared liberty, and then executed thousands of people in the Reign of Terror. The revolutionaries were so paranoid they started killing each other too. By the end, France traded a king for Napoleon, who crowned himself emperor anyway. Imagine throwing out your landlord, burning down the building, and then re-signing the lease with a new landlord who's even worse. That's France, turning freedom into an infinite loop of guillotines and dictatorships. 44. The Parthian Empire in Persia once lost an entire war because their king couldn't stop partying. He was assassinated by his own nobles while drunk at a feast. His successors fought each other, tearing the empire apart until Rome swooped in. It wasn't an invasion, it was an eviction after a centuries-long frat party. The Parthians weren't destroyed by great strategy. They were destroyed by hangovers and poor guest lists. 45. The British Raj in India was so obsessed with railroads that they bankrupted local economies by building lines designed for exports, not for people. When famine hit, food couldn't be distributed efficiently, and millions died. The empire that bragged about bringing progress couldn't figure out how to use its trains to save lives. It's the equivalent of owning a Ferrari and starving because you only drive it to the bank to withdraw overdraft fees. 46. The Seleucid Empire, one of Alexander's leftovers, collapsed partly because their kings kept trying to retake territory they couldn't hold. Instead of consolidating, they wasted decades fighting endless wars against Rome, Parthia, and local rebels. It's like watching someone keep doubling down at blackjack while broke. The empire didn't end with a bang. It ended like a bad gambler getting dragged out of the casino. 47. The Abbasid caliphs in later centuries became so paranoid about assassination that they basically imprisoned themselves in their palaces. They trusted eunuchs, concubines, and astrologers more than generals or ministers. The result? Total isolation, corruption, and collapse. Imagine a CEO who only takes advice from their pet parrot. The Abbasids weren't defeated, they just stopped showing up to work. 48. The Hawaiian Kingdom signed a constitution under duress in 1887, nicknamed the Bayonet Constitution because it was literally forced at gunpoint. This gutted royal power and handed control to foreign elites. The empire wasn't destroyed in a grand war. It was destroyed in the political equivalent of a bad timeshare deal. Hawaii didn't lose because of incompetence. They lost because they were bullied into signing the world's worst contract. 49. The Romanovs, yes, back to them, ignored the 1905 revolution by creating a parliament, then immediately stripping it of power. They tried to look democratic while being absolute monarchs, which fooled no one. By 1917, everyone was done playing along. It's like promising free Wi-Fi at a hotel and then charging $50 a day for basic browsing. The empire fell because people realized they were being scammed by the least convincing liars in history. 50. The Western Roman Empire's final emperor, Romulus Augustulus, was overthrown by a barbarian general named Odoacer. And the kicker? Nobody really cared. Rome, the greatest empire of its time, ended not with a bang, but with a shrug. The people were so exhausted by corruption, invasions, and taxes that losing the empire felt like canceling a bad subscription service. Rome didn't collapse. It quietly auto-renewed as medieval Europe. 51. And here's the crown jewel of stupidity, the Trojan War. An entire decade-long war, thousands dead, cities burned, all because one guy stole another guy's wife. And when it finally ended, it wasn't through brilliance or strategy. It ended because the Trojans looked at a giant wooden horse parked outside their gates and said, "Yeah, bring it inside." What's the worst that could happen? This wasn't fate. This wasn't destiny. This was the single dumbest group decision in human history. Forget empires collapsing from famine, taxes, or inbreeding. Troy fell because its rulers literally invited death into their living room and said, "Nice decoration." If stupidity could be bottled, it would be shaped like a horse. Mic drop. So there you have it. Dozens of empires that managed to collapse not because of fate, destiny, or superior enemies, but because human beings are apparently allergic to common sense. It's like history's greatest hits, except every track is a blooper reel. And now it's your turn. Drop your pick for the absolute dumbest downfall in the comments, or throw in one I missed. Should stupidity get its own flag? Should we start a Hall of Fame? Hit that like button if you want more disasters, subscribe if you want the next round, and remember, this was just the surface. The deeper you dig into history, the dumber it gets.